Thank you, Liz, and thanks for having me. I am excited and a little trepidated, I guess, to be here, to be at this kind of event. And I guess what I'm going to do today is just give you a kind of quick whistle-stop tour of quite a different point of view and a different perspective on academic publishing. I'm here as an academic, and we have heard from some academic speakers already in the programme, but I'm also here as a humanities academic. I spend most of my time researching and supervising students who research science fiction and utopian literature, so this presents a different sort of challenge, I guess. And what I'd like to do really is to sort of suggest my own modest proposal, whilst I have a room full of publishers listening perhaps, and to suggest that academics aren't just consumers, as perhaps has been referred to earlier. I was a little confused about whether consumer meant the research community or whether it also meant the library directors who are in charge of budgets for purchasing journal subscriptions and so on. It seems to me a conflation, and I think it's particularly unhelpful. I don't think it contributes to the sort of bridging and partnership that David Sweeney was advocating, in which we need to rethink a publishing landscape with academics firmly in mind. It's not just that academics are giving value-added tasks for free, as Nick was just describing. It's actually that we are writing and producing the content that publishers then present. And of course, publishers, from my perspective, add some value, but I would insist that the academics are producing the material themselves. So, I'd like to take you through a few examples from the humanities then to think through what's actually happening and whether some sort of disruption is taking place or not. The case for making scholarship openly available is gathering pace, as we've heard. The combination of the open access movement and also crises in library budgets to meet soaring costs of commercially published academic journals has led over the past 10 years, but particularly the last 5 or 6 years, to the rise of national level institutional and funding council mandates for open access. In the UK, the research councils providing their own guidance, in the EU with Horizon 2020, and in places like Australia with the Australian Research Council. And over the past few years, debates concerning open access publishing have moved away from whether it's possible or even desirable, and actually to more logistical and pragmatic questions. It's here to stay: open data, open science, open access. So how can we facilitate this? And I think now, in 2018, we've reached a position in which various different stakeholders, it's a term I don't like, but I understand we need to use it, and by stakeholders, I would include publishers, scholarly societies, editorial communities and networks, and also university libraries. We all need to be coordinating our efforts, and we need to be transitioning towards publishing which removes price and permission barriers to accessing research. So there's a pressing need then to reflect upon the wider shifts and also the implications of these shifts in publishing. And I'm going to focus today just on the humanities discipline. Humanities often get excluded from these kinds of conversations. It obviously bugs me that science is taken to mean all academic research, but I would like to make the case for humanities having a special kind of character that I'm going to come on to describe. There have, of course, been a number of innovators and disruptors who work in the humanities areas, new platforms and new presses, born digital publishers. And among these, I would include the open book publishers, the Open Humanities Press down here at the bottom right, which has been going for a number of years and which is very much academic-led. It's an academic community publishing for themselves and bypassing other publishers in the process. And of course, Knowledge Unlatched and the University of California's newly launched mega journal, Collabra. So my own experience in running and founding the Open Library of Humanities, which I'll say more about towards the end of the talk, I think has given a really interesting insight into a number of different aspects, the kind of political and social aspects of change. Technology itself might be a disruptor, but the technology is harnessed and used by people, and we've seen a number of different social barriers moving towards open access. For example, claims that scholars aren't interested in publishing open access and that they're just sticking to traditional reputational patterns, the problems of hierarchies and prestige that underpin the way in which academic careers are made and maintained. Also, of course, this is a new open access publishing platform, so there's a social side to the way in which we launched OLH, as well as a technological side. I wanted to briefly consider some editorial implications. I think now that these open access and born digital publishers are flourishing, that there's a kind of diversity in the publishing landscape alongside traditional and legacy publishers offering their own open access output, I think we've reached a moment where we can start to think a bit more creatively about how is this reframing and reshaping the sort of research that we do. So how are current editorial practices being affected? What kind of editorial measures do we need to be developing? How do we maintain academic rigour and quality in this scholarship? And particularly, although I would suggest this is less of an issue now, how do we overcome the kinds of disparaging remarks that we certainly used to hear about open access publishing not being as rigorous as traditional publishing? Do we continue using traditional double-blind peer review? Do we trial moving towards post-publication peer review? And I was particularly interested in hearing earlier comments about the riskiness, I think you described it as the younger early career researchers saying that open review might be a little bit risky. So I have a few thoughts on that later. How does the journal article or the scholarly monograph sit as an output within and related to a broader research process? Jean-Claude Bergelmann earlier on described how he said we're moving, or he hopes that we are soon moving, towards peer-reviewed open access research flow. That is, we are disaggregating one finished hermetically sealed product and we're opening up an entire workflow that is more transparent, that is more collaborative, that is more dialogic, and that this could be a disruptive paradigm shift. And are these potentials for this shift equally felt amongst the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities? I would suggest actually that they're not. And what is the relationship between preprint servers and peer-reviewed journals? I think this is something that has come up recently in humanities fields with things like the Humanities Commons and the MLA Commons. The MLA, the Modern Languages Association of America, has recently launched its own repository core and is encouraging academics to be using this to upload their articles, but also it's part of that kind of scholarly network. It's a platform that encourages the gamification, if you want to put it that way, of academics connecting with one another. There's a political aspect too, of course. You may know that the MLA Commons was partly designed as a response to academia.edu and a growing backlash from politicised academics who are boycotting or refusing to use academia.edu because they see it as too commercially predatory. So we are seeing these kind of non-profit alternatives. But just on that question of preprint servers, I also think that the humanities are kind of distinct. We've seen in STEM subjects with the success of servers such as Archive and BioArchive, the way in which uploading research as soon as it's available can radically change the way in which research is being discussed and read. In January 2016, eLife, the peer-reviewed biomedical and life sciences journals, was among one of the first journals to participate in a direct transfer initiative with BioArchive, meaning that authors could put their preprint on the archive and then it would be directly submitted into the journal without having to re-enter submission data or uploading files and so on. So we know that in the sciences, the medical sciences, physics, astronomy and so on, that these are incredibly successful and popular. But I'm still not sure that in humanities research, that many researchers are comfortable with sharing what they see as unfinished articles as research in process. So I think we have a long way to go in opening up that kind of research. As an editor of an open access journal, I'm also interested in questions such as technological innovations. How can these transform scholarly dialogue? One of these is scholarly annotations and giving more nuance to the settings that we have on annotations. This is something that we're working on at the Open Library of Humanities in refining annotative functionality and particularly in setting different privacy settings so that scholarly annotations can be given by a user publicly, or they can be part of a private group, or an individual can annotate their own work. And I think as an academic this is incredibly exciting because it means, for instance, that you could be setting your students' articles on the server, and then you could be setting up a private group for them to annotate perhaps in advance of class to prove that they've done the reading and they've had a scholarly conversation. So there are all kinds of exciting opportunities that this technology allows us, and making this technology open source means that it is kept up to date with users on sites such as GitHub, and also makes it much more easy to share with everybody. There are also questions of subject-specific focus and interdisciplinarity, and coming, as I'll describe later, the question of the multidisciplinary or the mega journal. This has raised all kinds of interesting questions for me as someone who edits a quote-unquote mega journal. How do we encourage researchers and editorial practices that can help foster high-quality research that is genuinely interdisciplinary, that wouldn't easily sit within any single disciplinary niche or silo and wouldn't necessarily be appropriate for pre-existing journals? How do we maintain rigor and quality, as I've already mentioned? And what are the multimodal possibilities and benefits of digital publishing? In my own field of literary studies, it allows us the opportunity to engage more with disciplines like film and TV or new media studies, with dance studies, musicology, drama and performance. And in working with section editors in film and TV, I've always been struck that print publishing is antithetical to the way in which film scholars would do their own research on a visual and an audiovisual medium. Digital publishing obviously allows the possibility to embed clips, to embed actual sections of film material, rather than having to just sort of describe them in words. But it also presents us with the challenges of establishing internationally prestigious and robust criteria under which we can share copyrighted material. And that's something that I would suggest film scholars have been leading the way in doing. And then finally, what are the barriers to digital publishing? How do we address perceived issues around quality and the impact that open access publishing might have on scholars' careers? I guess I would say from my own experience, the thing that's really struck me is, whilst it remains true that venue of publication, and by that I mean, for example, journal title, is still incredibly important, I've also found that actually the prestige that editors bring to work can attract more conservative or cautious academics away from their preferred journals onto new open access publishing venues. And it means that actually scholars don't mind so much if they're publishing in a new project, so long as the right editors are editing and curating that material. And I think that should give us cause for quiet optimism. So I'm just going to skip that because we don't need that. Okay. So far, the kinds of things I've outlined relate particularly to the removal of permission barriers. Open access, as you all know, it refers to the removal of price and permission barriers, meaning preventing readers from accessing material online, but also preventing authors from being able to share their work without permission from a publisher. Of course, this would be due to the copyright waivers or transfer agreements that author will have signed with the publisher. So we know about the removal of the price barrier for readers. We've heard that open access presents unparalleled opportunities to challenge things like public health and global poverty. It empowers readers. Anybody with a smartphone, even an orphan in Thailand with a smartphone, will be able to access this research, as we heard powerfully described earlier. But the thing that hasn't been addressed, to my mind, is the kind of the barriers towards open access in terms of shifting that price, that cost of publishing, from the reader to the author. Since the early 2000s, the emergence of the article processing charge has meant that publishers have been transferring the cost of publishing scholarship from the reader to the author. And of course, this works very well. We know this works very well in the sciences. We knew early on with examples such as PLOS, PLOS One, all the different PLOS subject journals, that APCs were relatively sustainable. But I'm here to tell you that in the humanities, this is not the case. We're talking about very small research budgets, we're talking about small disciplines, and we're talking about researchers who are strapped for cash. We're also talking about researchers who don't have permanent positions. We heard a talk about early career researchers. Many of the people with whom we're working in an early career sense aren't in a permanent post. They don't have recourse to APC funds. They may be self-funded, and so it's an incredibly unfair system that privileges, senior level professors being able to pay APCs and means that younger scholars who are already extremely put upon in all kinds of different ways can't. How much do article processing charges cost? They're extremely variable. It's actually quite hard to get a sense of costs. They change over time. We know that the PLOS journals range between $1,300 and up to $3,000. We know that SAGE, I had a look at some of the journals yesterday. Again, they range between $1,000 and $2,000 US. We know that Taylor and Francis articles in one of the Open Select journals is $2,950. The graph behind me has been produced by JISC, the Joint Information Scholarly Communications team in the UK, who provides digital infrastructure to all of the universities. In June 2016, they reported that the number of article processing charges, this is a couple of years old now, doubled between 2013 and 2014. They said growth remained strong into 2015, but it slowed partly due to limited room for growth in institutions' internal budgets. Already there are alarm bells that we know that pressure to raise APC prices is continuing, and we're starting to reach a limit on what libraries are prepared to pay for those article processing charges. The average APC increased by 6% between 2014 and 2016. And expenditure on APCs, no surprises, is very unevenly distributed between publishers, with the lion's share of income just going to a handful of major publishers. So this then leads us to think, are there any alternatives to article processing charges? And this was really the climate in 2012 and 2013, back around the time of the Finch report, as we heard earlier, in which my colleague Martin and I decided to set up a project, the Open Library of Humanities. For us, it was absolutely central that article processing charges do not have a long-term sustainable future for humanities researchers. That is our perspective as researchers, as academics. We also happen to think they're incredibly unfair for the reasons I just outlined, that many people don't have access to money to pay article processing charges. So we decided to try and set up perhaps a utopian project. Could we be publishing high-quality, immediately gold, open access research in the humanities without recourse to APCs? What we did was to set up a scholar-led charitable organisation dedicated to publishing without these fees, funded by an international consortium of libraries who have joined us in a mission to try and make scholarly publishing fairer, more accessible, and also rigorously preserved for the digital future. Our initial idea was to have a large multidisciplinary journal called Open Library of Humanities. We still have that. but it quickly became clear that actually journal title and the scholarly communities which are so invested in that title's reputation was very important. And so what we did was we became a platform for all kinds of journals. As we said, this is some time ago, when we launched in September 2015, the traditional foundations of research publication economy are unravelling in the face of unprecedented digital capability and concomitant social expectations. Ironically, in the age of digital reproduction, the circulation of our academic humanities journals is decreasing because libraries can't afford to subscribe in the face of increasing volume of material and hyperinflationary price increases. So even while we have the technological capacity to disseminate and preserve our work online, we're seeing libraries having to cancel subscriptions. So what we did then was to introduce a new funding model. We called it the Library Partnership Subsidy. And this is a subsidy, of course, because none of these libraries are subscribing. There is no subscription. All this material is available to anybody with an internet connection. But we asked libraries if they wanted to join us in a mission. So it has a strong social and political aspect to it, that we're trying to build a more sustainable future that is academic-led. And we've had a fantastic response. More than 230 libraries worldwide have already signed up to join our scheme, and it also gives them some say and some control over what it is we're publishing, because they have voting rights. We ask them, for instance, we're considering taking on some new journals. Would you agree to fund these journals? And they can say yes, or they can say no, as they see fit and as they see appropriate. It's an extremely cost-effective way of publishing. It means that because we're publishing ourselves and because we're producing the technology and the software for our own publishing, we're able to put price pressure into the market. It means that we actually know how much it costs per article, per unit to publish. And so we're able to put pressure on the kinds of publishers that we work with, and we don't work with anybody who won't agree to our pricing strategy. I'll come back to that in a moment. Just to give you a sense of some of the libraries who are working with us, as you can see, we have a huge number of supporters in North America and Canada, many of the universities in the UK, perhaps no surprise, that's where Martin and myself are based. Also in Australia and New Zealand. Throughout Europe, Belgium, Finland, Sweden, all 7 of the universities of the Republic of Ireland, which we're quite proud of. And here in Germany as well, support has been growing, particularly in the last year. We now have 11 of the leading German research libraries on board. So, what do our journals get? They get the platform, they get dedicated editorial and technological support. We offer XML, PDF, and HTML typesetting. It's quite unusual to have XML typesetting. It means that articles could be forward migrated at any point should they wish to. We offer cross-ref DOIs, digital preservation in clocks, all of the things you would expect of any of the publishers in this room who publish open access. We're harvested by indexing service, EBSCO host via Paperity, the MLA bibliography, entry into the DOAJ, and so on. So this is just a really quick, I think I've only got maybe 3 minutes, 5 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. This is just a quick overview then of our current output. We currently have 23 journals. So I guess what I'm saying to you is we are a small publisher. We are a small example of what can be done. But given the barriers to open access publishing and the challenges of setting up any kind of new publisher in such a competitive landscape, I would suggest that we've been very successful. Also, I would say that actually more than 2/3 of the journals who apply to join us are rejected. That's not because they're not excellent quality journals. We put all of them out to external review, so we know the quality of what we're taking on. But that is simply because we're growing at a sustainable and relatively conservative rate. So I think that academics, editorial boards have a huge desire and appetite for moving to a not-for-profit or a born digital open access publisher. Okay, so we've got a range of different disciplines: literature, liberal arts, architecture, archaeology, linguistics, religious study, women's studies, comic studies, and so on. It's interesting to note that many of these journals still use issues. They still like, even though we can publish rolling publication, meaning that we can make any article available as soon as it's passed through peer review and gone through production. Actually, many of them still hold on to a traditional print-based model. And as David mentioned earlier, that reputational currency of journals continues to bear influence on academics' choices of where to publish. So it occurred to us, if it's difficult to change academic behaviour and it's difficult to persuade academics that it doesn't matter where you publish, just as a side note, this is particularly of relevance in the UK context, where with our research excellence framework, we're being told by HEFCE and by the REF consultants that they're not going to take into account the journal title of where work is being published. Academics' perception is important. Academics actually remain very sceptical and very attached to journal title. So we decided then, if you can't change that behaviour, or if it's going to take decades to change that behaviour, what we should do really is we should be moving sorry, I'm just going to move past that. We should be moving journals and their entire communities onto our platform. Okay, so just to finish up, there are other examples other than the Open Library of Humanities that are doing really interesting and innovative things in humanities research. Media Commons Press, the Digital Scholarly Network. It is a community network for scholars and practitioners in media studies, and they've been experimenting with different kinds of publishing. They partnered with the Future of the Book, for example, to think through a more community-driven response to publishing. They maintain a blog with sophisticated user profiles, links to people's published research, and so on. The Jason Mattel published his landmark book, Complex TV, contemporary storytelling on the Media Commons Press site. And this is interesting because it was published as an in-progress manuscript with peer-to-peer review. So this is an example of open review of a scholarly monograph. Chapters were serialized in installments between 2012 and 2013. So this brings me to a concluding point then. Open review allows scholars to make commentary more transparent. It can increase the number of reviewers. It helps to disaggregate the scholarly monograph as one finished product and think more about that workflow and that research process. But, and I think this is an important but, it might be one thing for somebody like Jason Mattel, who's a very famous author, or Kathleen Fitzpatrick, whose Planned Obsolescence was also openly reviewed. It's one thing for them to attract reviewers, but it's quite another thing for an unheard of PhD student publishing their first monograph. How do we know that we're going to populate their monograph with reviewers unless reviewers are compensated? So I think there are important questions that haven't yet been answered. Finally then, opening up scholarly dialogue, using digital resources and things like the annotation tools I mentioned earlier. Interoperability is really important. It's no good if you have annotation tools that cannot connect to one another, or whereby those comments just disappear if the archive is lost. These things need to be protected in the longer term. They provide a space for constructive critical engagement. They allow authors to engage with readers and enable a new kind of online social reading. So I'm very proud at the OLH that we're helping to push forward technological change in this area. Thank you, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you. I think that was a very timely reminder that we are supposed to be here serving the entire academic community, those that aren't funded, those that don't follow the scientific method, and thank you. Any questions? Charlie.
Hello, Charlie Rappel from QDOS. Thank you for your great talk. Towards the end, when you mentioned transitioning communities across, can you talk a little bit more about what that means and how you do that?
Yep. So this is the point that academics, we're wed to these journals. Many of these journals have been going for many decades. They're prestigious, they have reputations, they have communities attached to them. It doesn't make sense to just say, we'll build a new platform and people will populate it. It's not the technology and the innovation in technology that's stopping us from moving to open access. It's things like social conservatism, it's the pressures of university careers, the pressures on early career researchers, as we've heard. So that's why very quickly, very early on in the OLH process, we decided to encourage journals to move to us, so that we are now we are a publisher of journals. We offer them the platform, and we also offer them the funding by which to publish everything open access. So we actively work with editorial boards to consider new journals that may be reconsidering their contracts with publishers, that may be looking for something a little bit different. What can I say? We've been inundated with applications. We have many more journals wishing to join OLH than, unfortunately, we can actually accept. And I think that tells this room something about the editorial and academic appetite for gold open access publishing with a not-for-profit publisher. We might be a small example, but I think we're quite illustrative that many academics are really fed up with the treatment by their publishers and the restrictive terms under which they might be able to move to hybrid or gold open access publishing. So you can disagree with me, you can listen to a salutary warning that this is what happens if you don't listen to your editorial boards. We welcome them onto OLH, what can I say?
Any other questions? Heather.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Heather Staines, the Director of Partnerships for Hypothesis. We're an open source nonprofit annotation company, and we have a coalition called the Annotating All Knowledge Coalition to develop and further interoperable annotation based on the standard, and we'd love to talk to you guys about joining the coalition. It's free if anyone's interested, so.
Yes, please. My colleague Martin Eve has been working with some of your colleagues at Hypothesis, but yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
I had a question. Oh, I will let the floor have the question first. Okay.
Hello, my name's Jill Taylor-Rowe. As both a humanities graduate and a university librarian, I absolutely applaud what you're doing. Can you think of any other ways in which you think university libraries could help and support this as this sort of development is enhanced?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so far, we've been working quite closely with, for example, Lyrasis in North America and JISC in the UK. So JISC obviously manages the negotiations between the libraries and the publishers, and so they've been giving us advice and support in thinking through how do we mediate with libraries. We have banded library rates. We're happy to hear from any librarians if they're facing budgetary difficulties, for example. We're just happy to talk to libraries. I guess, I mean, it's also sort of, it's a kind of activism, really. It requires library directors to be talking to themselves, to organisations like us, but also other not-for-profits, in thinking through how they might be able to spend part of their budget on something which is a longer-term strategy. What we're talking about here, whilst the OLH, I think, has done really well, it's still early days. We're thinking through a much more sustainable, longer-term solution to open access publishing and gold publishing, not just requiring authors to have to self-deposit on, green archives and so on. So always happy to hear more.
My question. So we work, many of us, and we have in the audience as well, work with learned societies. And often a learned society is reliant on its journal and the returns of that journal to fund really important scholarly activity, conferences and bursaries and everything else. Have you had any conversations about the impact of this on that ecosystem?
Yeah, we have. Actually, I think I can't remember off the top of my head, at least 3 of our journals are scholarly society journals. So this has been particularly interesting. People were very worried about scholarly societies moving to a gold open access publisher with a digital format, because they were saying our members expect the journal in the post. You know, they're going to say, am I getting my money's worth? What we found with the scholarly societies that we work with is that it hasn't been a problem at all. I've recently launched a new scholarly society in contemporary literature. We already have an open access journal. So basically, when we sought membership from our community, we broke down what their membership benefits would include. Things like advocacy for the discipline, support for early career researchers, mentoring, the conference, and it has not been a problem at all. We have soaring membership. So these are just some small examples. Obviously, different scholarly societies are different sizes. Some of them are very old and established, but it's interesting to note that it's not been a problem for us.
We're going to have to finish it there. We have another speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you.